What's the worst thing in the world? Taxes? No. Dental appointments. Getting closer. It's Karen Vaughn, the HOA president with a $10,000 smile and a heart made of ice. When she slapped a violation notice on my new fishing boat and said it doesn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic, she had no idea she just declared war on the wrong person. She wanted me to remove my boat. Fine. I'd move it right in front of her house, because that was my right as the new owner of her property. Where are you watching this video from? Comment below, because you won't want to miss the moment I turned Karen's fake smile into a look of pure panic when she realized I didn't just buy a boat. I bought her entire life. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Mason Reed, and until 6 months ago, I was living the American dream in a downtown condo, running a software startup I'd built from nothing. After a decade of 80-hour weeks and surviving on ramen and coffee, I finally hit the jackpot. A tech giant acquired my company for several $1 million. It should have been the happiest moment of my life, but it wasn't. You see, my wife Elizabeth wasn't there to celebrate with me. She'd lost her battle with cancer 18 months earlier, leaving me alone to raise our 12-year-old daughter Emma. Those first few months without Elizabeth were the darkest of my life. Emma withdrew into herself, her grades slipped, and I buried myself in work. We were both just going through the motions, living in the same space but each lost in our own grief. The company acquisition gave us a chance to press reset, a new beginning that we desperately needed. Elizabeth and I had always dreamed of moving to a nice suburban neighborhood with good schools and a lake nearby, where I could teach Emma to fish, something Elizabeth had loved doing with her own father. So when I sold the company, that's exactly what I did. I found what seemed like the perfect place. Willow Creek Estates, an upscale neighborhood with beautiful homes surrounding a private lake. The real estate agent showed me around, talked up the wonderful community, and handed me a binder of homeowners association documents that I admittedly only skimmed through before signing. That was my first mistake. I was too focused on the future I was trying to build for Emma to pay attention to the fine print that would soon make our lives miserable. Emma and I moved in during early spring. The neighborhood was beautiful, perfectly manicured lawns, flowering trees lining the streets, and an atmosphere of peaceful prosperity. It seemed like the ideal place for a fresh start. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, though most of them were quite a bit older and much more, let's say, established than us. I'd grown up in a working-class family, worked my way through college on scholarships, and built my business from scratch. These people were old money, country club memberships, and luxury car collections. Still, I figured we'd find our place. Everyone smiled and waved, though few actually came over to introduce themselves. Emma was nervous about starting at her new school, but I assured her everything would be fine. This is our new chapter, I told her. It's what Mom would have wanted for us. The second weekend after moving in, I surprised Emma with something I'd been planning for months. A modest 18-feet fishing boat. Nothing fancy, just perfect for a father and daughter to spend weekends on the lake, just like Elizabeth would have wanted. I'd researched models for weeks, wanting something safe, reliable, and easy to handle for a beginner. When the delivery truck pulled up with it, Emma came running outside, curious about the commotion. The moment the tarp was pulled back, revealing the gleaming white hull with Reed's Peace painted on the side, a name Elizabeth had once suggested for a boat we never got around to buying. I saw a spark in my daughter's eyes that had been missing since we lost her mother. The look on Emma's face when I unveiled it was worth every penny. For the first time since her mother died, I saw genuine excitement in her eyes. "Can we take it out today, Dad?" she asked, practically bouncing with excitement. I promised we would that weekend, once I'd registered it properly. In the meantime, I parked it in our driveway, planning to move it to the community dock later that week. That evening, Emma and I sat on the boat together, still in the driveway, planning our first fishing expedition. We pored over maps of the lake, discussed the types of fish we might catch, and I showed her the basics of tying fishing knots. For a few precious hours, it felt like we were healing, finding our way back to each other. That's when I met Karen Vaughn for the first time. I was in the yard when a silver Mercedes pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a woman in her mid-40s, expensively dressed, with not a hair out of place. Her smile was wide but didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be our newest neighbor," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Karen Vaughn, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I thought I'd stop by and welcome you personally." I shook her hand and introduced myself, but I could already tell she was assessing everything about me: my cargo shorts, my worn college t-shirt, the modest boat in the driveway. I later learned from Walter Parker, my 70-year-old neighbor and retired attorney, that Karen had already done her homework on me. She'd heard I wasn't old money and had marked me as someone who didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic before ever meeting me. Our conversation was pleasant enough on the surface, but underneath I could feel the judgment. "That's quite a boat you have there," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I'm sure Emma will love having it on the lake, but you know, of course, that we can't have boats parked in driveways in Willow Creek. It's against HOA regulations." I explained that it was temporary, just until the weekend when I'd move it to the dock. Karen's smile tightened. "Actually, there's a waiting list for dock space, and Section 8.3 of our covenants prohibits visible recreational vehicles of any kind. You'll need to store it off-site or face daily fines." I was confused. The real estate agent had specifically mentioned lake access as a selling point. When I said as much, Karen handed me a copy of the HOA regulations, a much thicker version than the abbreviated one I'd been given during the sale. "Page 42, Section 8.3, she said with a smile that barely concealed her satisfaction. "Perhaps you should familiarize yourself with all our regulations. We take our community standards very seriously here in Willow Creek." She glanced over at Emma, who was sitting in the boat pretending not to listen. "It would be such a shame for your daughter to be disappointed, but rules are rules. I'm sure you understand." As she drove away, I stood in my driveway, feeling like I had just been ambushed. When I looked down at Emma, who had come outside during our conversation, her excitement had been replaced with disappointment. That night, I read through the entire HOA rulebook, growing increasingly frustrated. The regulations were incredibly detailed and restrictive, controlling everything from the color of your mailbox to the types of flowers you could plant. There were rules about when you could have guests over, how long they could stay, and where they could park. The section on watercraft was particularly stringent: no boats stored visibly on any property, limited dock space allocated by seniority, and a waiting list that was, according to a footnote, currently closed to new residents until further notice. It felt less like a community and more like a dictatorship, with Karen Vaughn as its supreme leader. The next morning, I found a bright orange violation notice stuck to my boat: "Notice of covenant violation. Unauthorized vehicle must be removed within 48 hours or fines of $100 per day will be assessed." I tore it off, crumpled it up, and threw it away. That evening, there was a notice about improper garbage disposal taped to my mailbox. The day after that, I received a letter about my lawn being a quarter-inch too high. It was becoming clear that Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was targeting me specifically. When I tried to call the HOA office to discuss the situation, I was told Karen was unavailable, but that all violations needed to be remedied immediately to avoid escalating penalties. Emma noticed the tension building. "Are we in trouble, Dad?" she asked one evening, watching me measure the grass with a ruler to make sure it met the exact specifications. The absurdity of the situation hit me. Here I was, a grown man with a successful business exit behind me, measuring grass blades to please some power-hungry HOA president. "No, sweetie," I assured her. "We're just learning the rules of our new neighborhood." But I couldn't hide my frustration, and Emma was perceptive enough to know something was wrong. That night, I heard her crying in her room, looking at pictures of her mother on her phone. We'd moved here for a fresh start, for healing, and instead, we were being harassed by a woman who decided we didn't belong before she even met us. A week later, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting about recent violations threatening our community standards. When Emma and I arrived, we discovered the meeting was essentially a public shaming session aimed directly at us. Karen stood at the front of the room in the community center, PowerPoint ready, showing photos of my boat, my lawn, and even the basketball hoop I'd installed for Emma, apparently also against regulations. As we all know, maintaining our property values is our number one priority, Karen told the 20 or so neighbors gathered there, and that means enforcing our standards without exception. She looked directly at me. Even for those who might be new to our way of life. The presentation continued with Karen detailing every minor infraction she documented at our property, complete with time-stamped photos. Some people, she said with a meaningful glance in my direction, think that rules don't apply to them, that their personal circumstances somehow exempt them from the standards the rest of us uphold. She then showed a slide comparing property values in well-regulated communities versus those with lax enforcement. The implication was clear. I was a threat to everyone's home values, their investments, their very way of life. Most neighbors avoided looking at me, though a few shot sympathetic glances our way. Emma squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. I could see tears welling in her eyes as Karen continued her thinly veiled attack. After the meeting, I approached Karen, trying to be reasonable. Look, I understand the importance of community standards, I said, but some of these regulations weren't clearly communicated during the purchase. Maybe we could work together on a reasonable timeline for compliance. Karen's smile was cold. The regulations are the regulations, Mr. Reed. If you find them too burdensome, perhaps Willow Creek Estates isn't the right fit for you. She turned to walk away, then added over her shoulder, by the way, your fence is 2 inches higher than regulation. You'll be receiving a notice about that tomorrow. As we walked home afterward, Walter Parker caught up with us. Don't take it personally, son, he said, looking over his shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. She did the same thing to the Thompsons last year, and the Guptas before that. She's forced 3 families out of the neighborhood in the past year alone. You'll be next if you don't fall in line. I asked him why everyone put up with Karen's behavior. Walter sighed deeply. Fear, mostly. She's vindictive toward anyone who opposes her, and she's got friends on the zoning board, the city council, even a judge or 2. Most people find it easier to comply than fight. I looked down at my daughter, her eyes still wet from Karen's introduction to the entire neighborhood, and I knew no one was going to force us out. But if Karen wanted to play this game, I would show her how I played. Over the next few weeks, I did my research. I had the boat stored at a marina 20 minutes away and paid the ridiculous fine. I trimmed the lawn to exactly the required height. I took down Emma's basketball hoop. I was determined to follow every rule to the letter while figuring out my next move. But Karen wasn't satisfied. New violations appeared almost daily. The color of my mailbox, a bird feeder that attracted nuisance wildlife, flowers I'd planted that weren't on the approved vegetation list. It was harassment, plain and simple. Each violation came with a fine, and the fines were adding up. More concerning was the effect on Emma. She had become quiet and withdrawn again, afraid to do anything that might break a rule. The joy of our new beginning was being systematically crushed under Karen's designer heel. I started connecting with other homeowners discreetly, learning I wasn't the only one suffering under Karen's regime. The Wilsons had been fined for their son's wheelchair ramp, which Karen deemed an unapproved modification. They eventually got an exception under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but only after hiring an attorney. The Garcias had been cited for excessive gathering when they hosted a First Communion celebration for their daughter. The pattern was clear. Karen targeted anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of what the community should look like, using the HOA regulations as her weapon. I sought Walter's legal advice. He was a retired corporate attorney who'd practiced for over 40 years. The problem, he explained, is that HOAs have tremendous power. Courts generally uphold their right to set and enforce rules, even seemingly arbitrary ones. Your best bet is to find procedural violations in how the rules were created or enforced. So I started digging. I attended every HOA meeting, recording everything. I requested all HOA records, minutes, financial statements, anything I could legally access. I befriended Lisa Wilson, the timid but honest 50-year-old HOA secretary, who began slipping me information about how Karen operated. Lisa was a treasure trove of insider knowledge. I've worked for 3 HOA presidents before Karen. She told me during a clandestine meeting at a coffee shop well outside Willow Creek. None of them were perfect, but Karen is different. She sees the HOA as her personal kingdom. Lisa had been keeping her own private records of Karen's misconduct, afraid to speak up but unwilling to be complicit in the abuse. She changes meeting minutes after I've typed them up. She holds unannounced meetings with just her allies on the board. She's even forged signatures on proxy votes when she needed to push something through. What I discovered was shocking. Karen had been selectively enforcing rules against people she deemed undesirable. She'd been holding emergency board meetings without proper notice when she wanted to push through new regulations. She'd even been altering meeting minutes after they were approved. Most disturbing of all, Lisa showed me evidence that Karen had been funneling HOA maintenance contracts to companies owned by her friends at inflated prices, likely in exchange for kickbacks. This wasn't just petty tyranny, it was potentially criminal. The landscaping company that maintained the common areas was owned by her brother-in-law and charged 40% above market rates. The security service belonged to her tennis partner's husband. The pool maintenance firm had no other clients and had been incorporated just days before receiving the Willow Creek contract. I also uncovered an old regulation, conveniently removed from the current rule book but never properly rescinded according to state law, that allowed boats to be parked in driveways if the owner obtained signatures from 75% of neighbors approving it. I started going door to door with a petition, but I quickly hit a wall of fear. People would listen sympathetically, but when it came time to sign, they'd glance nervously up and down the street and make excuses. I'd love to help, but my variance request for a new gazebo is pending. Or we're trying to sell next year, and we can't risk getting on Karen's bad side. Several brave souls did sign, but within days, they called to ask me to remove their name, citing mysterious concerns that had been raised about their own properties. Nancy Fisher, an elderly widow who lived 3 doors down, was one of the few who stood firm. Karen has been bullying people for years, she told me, her hands shaking slightly as she signed my petition. My husband George would have stood up to her if he were still alive. I'll do it for him. The next day, Nancy received a violation notice for the rose trellis that had been in her garden for 20 years. When I visited to check on her, she was in tears. I can't afford the fines, she admitted. I'm on a fixed income. I'll have to take it down. Meanwhile, Karen launched a smear campaign against me. Suddenly, rumors spread that I was some kind of troublemaker who wanted to bring down property values and destroy the character of the neighborhood. She even implied to several neighbors that my tech business had engaged in questionable practices, and that's why I had suddenly sold it. It was character assassination, and it was working. People who had been friendly before now avoided eye contact when I passed them on the street. I overheard whispers at the community pool about the nouveau riche disruptor who didn't understand our standards. Even Emma felt the impact at school, where classmates whose parents lived in Willow Creek had begun excluding her from social events. I was at my lowest point, seriously considering selling the house at a loss and moving somewhere else, when Walter called me over one evening. "Take a look at this," he said, showing me a private real estate listing on his computer. It was Karen's house. She was selling quietly and quickly. According to Walter's sources, she was planning to cash out, move to a more prestigious neighborhood across town, and leave behind the mess she'd created. She does this, Walter explained, manipulates the rules to drive out anyone who might oppose her, then sells high and moves on once she's consolidated power. The listing described Karen's home as a prestigious property in an exclusive, meticulously regulated community with exceptionally high property values. The asking price was well above market value, even for Willow Creek. She's going to cash in on the very standards she's been terrorizing everyone about, Walter said with disgust. And whoever buys her house will probably be cut from the same cloth. The cycle will continue. As I stared at the listing for Karen's sprawling colonial house, listed at almost $1 million, a crazy idea began to form in my mind. If Karen thought she could run people's lives and then walk away, she had no idea what was coming. I called Michael Harrison, my attorney who had handled the sale of my company, and Daniel Green, a college friend who'd become a successful real estate broker. Together, we formulated a plan that was entirely legal but deliciously devious. Daniel was particularly enthusiastic. He'd had his own run-in with an oppressive HOA years earlier and relished the opportunity for some poetic justice. "You're going to need a shell company," Michael advised, "and ironclad paperwork. If you want this to work, everything has to be by the book." Daniel nodded in agreement. "And I'll handle the negotiations. Karen doesn't know me, and I can play the part of representing a wealthy client who values privacy. She'll never suspect a thing." First, we established Willow Legacy LLC, a shell company with me as the silent owner. Michael set up the legal structure carefully, ensuring everything was legitimate and untraceable back to me. Then Daniel reached out to Karen's listing agent, expressing interest from a wealthy but very private buyer. We made an attractive offer, full asking price, but with conditions: a quick, close, minimal inspection, and most importantly, complete confidentiality. The agent was thrilled. Karen was cautious but intrigued. Through careful investigation, Daniel discovered that Karen was in financial trouble. Despite her designer clothes and luxury car, Daniel discovered she had maxed out multiple credit cards, lost heavily in a risky real estate investment, and her second ex-husband had just won a lawsuit reducing his alimony payments. The bank was threatening foreclosure on another property she owned. She needed a quick, clean sale. Exactly what we were offering. Her facade of wealth and power was just that, a facade crumbling under the weight of bad financial decisions and overextension. While these negotiations were happening, I kept up appearances in the neighborhood. I made a show of looking at houses in other areas. I told neighbors we were probably moving soon, given the unwelcoming atmosphere. I even put a "for sale by owner" sign in my yard. Karen was ecstatic, telling everyone who would listen that she'd successfully maintained neighborhood standards. At one point, she even stopped by, pretending to be concerned. "I hear you're thinking of moving," she said with poorly disguised satisfaction. "I hope it's not because of any misunderstandings about our community expectations." I assured her it was purely a personal decision, and I hoped to find a neighborhood that was a better fit for us. She practically glowed with triumph. Little did she know, she had just accepted an offer from my LLC to buy her house and had signed a contract giving the new owner early access for measuring and planning renovations before the official closing. The contract included specific language about the seller vacating any personal items from the property during this early access period, as contractors would be coming and going. Karen, eager to secure the sale, had agreed to all terms without suspicion. My attorney had crafted the agreement masterfully, making it airtight while hiding any connection to me. The day before Karen's planned goodbye party for us. Yes, she actually organized a party to celebrate running us out of the neighborhood. I received the keys to her house. I couldn't believe my plan was actually working. With the keys in my hand, I felt a mix of vindication and nervousness. This was really happening. I immediately called the boat transport company. "Can you deliver my boat to this new address tomorrow morning?" I asked. Karen wanted me to remove my boat from my property. Fine. I park it in the most legally appropriate place possible, right in front of her house on property that now belonged to me. Tom, the boat transport driver, was initially confused when I explained what I wanted. "Let me get this straight," he said. "You want me to deliver your boat to someone else's house?" I clarified that it was actually my house now and showed him the paperwork. His confusion turned to amusement. "Man, I've seen some petty neighbor feuds in my time, but this is next level. I'm in." We agreed on an early morning delivery, before most of the neighborhood would be up and about. I wanted everything in place before Karen's party. The next day was one I'll never forget. Karen had invited the entire neighborhood to her home for afternoon cocktails and a fond farewell to the Reeds. Though in reality, it was a victory celebration for having driven us out. The invitation, delivered to every home except ours, described it as a gathering to celebrate our community's continued commitment to excellence. Walter had shown me his copy, shaking his head at the audacity. Meanwhile, Tom from the boat transport company and I had arrived at Karen's house early that morning. We positioned my boat perfectly in her circular driveway, prominently visible from the street. Tom, who found the whole situation hilarious once I explained it, helped me set up multiple signs around the property. Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And my personal favorite, 24/7 video surveillance in progress. We worked efficiently, and by 8 o'clock in the morning, everything was in place. I positioned a lawn chair next to the boat and settled in to wait, thermos of coffee in hand. I had arranged for Jennifer Brady, a notary public and old friend of my late wife, to attend Karen's party. Her job was simple: be a legal witness to whatever happened next. Jennifer had known Elizabeth since college and had seen firsthand how devastated Emma and I had been after her death. When I explained what Karen had been doing to us, she was more than happy to help. Elizabeth would have loved this, she assured me. She always said you played chess while everyone else was playing checkers. As guests began arriving for the party, they were confused by the boat and signs but assumed there must be some explanation. Karen was inside, greeting early arrivals, completely unaware of what awaited her. I could see her through the window, champagne flute in hand, laughing and chatting, the picture of sophisticated hospitality. Several guests pointed toward the driveway, but she dismissed their concerns without looking, probably assuming it was just late arriving guests or a delivery. When she finally stepped outside to investigate the commotion on her front lawn, the look on her face was worth every penny I'd spent and every headache I'd endured. Her expression transformed in stages: confusion, recognition, shock, and then pure, undiluted rage. She stood frozen for a moment, processing the sight of my boat in her driveway, surrounded by warning signs, with me sitting calmly beside it. The gathered guests peered around her, murmuring in confusion and disbelief. Her smile vanished, replaced by shock that quickly morphed into rage. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, storming toward me. "How dare you park that monstrosity on my property? I'm calling the police right now." The gathered neighbors watched in stunned silence as Karen pulled out her phone and dialed 911, reporting vandalism and trespassing. I simply stood there, smiling calmly, as Jennifer recorded everything on her phone. Karen's voice grew increasingly frantic as she described the situation to the dispatcher. "No, you don't understand. He's trespassing. This man has put his hideous boat in my driveway." "Yes, I need officers here immediately." Several neighbors were now recording the scene on their phones, while others whispered among themselves. I remained calm, waiting for the police to arrive. Emma had stayed home with Walter. This was one confrontation I didn't want her to witness firsthand. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, Karen was in full meltdown mode, demanding they arrest me and impound my boat. Officer Martinez listened patiently to her tirade before turning to me. "Sir, can you explain what's happening here?" I handed him a folder containing all the legal documents showing that Willow Legacy LLC, which I then revealed was owned by me, had legally purchased Karen's house, and that I had contractual rights to access the property before closing. As the legal owner, I explained, I'm simply parking my boat on my own property, which violates no laws or HOA regulations. The officer reviewed the documents carefully, occasionally glancing up at Karen, whose face had gone from red with anger to ashen with shock. He consulted with his partner, who also examined the paperwork. "These appear to be in order," Officer Martinez finally said. He turned to Karen with a look of confusion. "Ma'am, it appears that Mr. Reed owns this property now. It seems you're holding a party on his private property without permission." Karen collapsed onto a nearby lawn chair, her face ashen. "This is impossible," she whispered. "This is my house." I stepped forward, holding up the contract with her signature. "Actually, Karen, you sold it to my company last week, and according to the terms you agreed to, I have full access rights starting yesterday." The gathered neighbors gasped collectively. Jennifer, playing her role perfectly, stepped forward with additional notarized documents confirming everything I'd said. But I wasn't done. "By the way, Karen," I added, loud enough for everyone to hear, "while you're processing this information, you should know that I've been gathering evidence of your selective rule enforcement, procedural violations, and potential financial improprieties as HOA president. I have affidavits from multiple residents describing harassment, falsified meeting minutes, and unauthorized rule changes. I gestured to Lisa Wilson, who had arrived with a thick folder of documents. The HOA secretary has been quite helpful in providing the actual records, which differ significantly from the versions you've presented to the community. The partygoers were stunned into silence. Several board members looked particularly uncomfortable, no doubt wondering if they might be implicated in Karen's schemes. One woman whispered audibly, "I told you those special assessments didn't add up." Another man muttered, "So that's why the Guptas really moved." The community was witnessing the unraveling of Karen's carefully constructed dominion in real time, and the atmosphere was electric with shock and a growing sense of liberation. Karen's face cycled through emotions: shock, anger, fear, and finally calculation. She pulled herself together remarkably quickly, her legal training kicking in. "This is absurd," she announced to the onlookers. "Mr. Reed clearly obtained this purchase through fraudulent means. I'll have this contract invalidated by tomorrow." She turned to her guests. "I apologize for this unpleasant scene. The party is postponed until this matter is resolved." As people began to leave, whispering among themselves, Karen approached me with a threatening whisper. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have connections with every judge in this county. You'll regret this little stunt." Over the next week, Karen tried everything to invalidate the sale. She claimed fraud, misrepresentation, duress, anything to get her house back. She hired an aggressive attorney and filed emergency motions to block the final closing. But Maya Torres, the HOA attorney I'd retained who specialized in HOA abuse cases, systematically dismantled every argument. Maya was brilliant in court, presenting evidence that all disclosures had been proper, all terms clearly stated, and that Karen had signed the documents of her own free will. The fact that Ms. Vaughn failed to read the contract carefully or investigate the buyer thoroughly does not constitute fraud or misrepresentation on the part of Willow Legacy LLC. Maya argued successfully. The contract was ironclad, the sale legitimate, and all proper procedures had been followed. Meanwhile, I continued sleeping in my original house while keeping the boat prominently parked in Karen's driveway, a daily reminder of her predicament. The community was buzzing with the drama. People who had been afraid to speak up before were now sharing their stories of Karen's tyrannical rule. The Garcias revealed how Karen had tried to block their home purchase because she wasn't sure they'd fit in. The Williamses told how she threatened to fine them for their holiday decorations being ethnically inappropriate. Nancy Fisher proudly reinstalled her rose trellis. It was as if a spell had been broken, and people were awakening from a collective fear. Karen tried to rally the HOA board and residents against me, but the tide was turning as more of her questionable practices came to light. People began distancing themselves from her. Lisa Wilson publicly shared records of how Karen had manipulated votes and changed rules without proper approval. Even Claire Bennett, a board member who had previously been too intimidated to oppose Karen, started speaking out about witnessing improper practices. She told us it was just streamlining procedures when she bypassed votes. Claire admitted during an emergency board meeting, "I should have spoken up sooner." The financial improprieties were particularly damning. An audit revealed that under Karen's leadership, the HOA had been paying well above market rates for services provided by companies connected to her friends and family. There were unexplained administrative fees that seemed to disappear into accounts only Karen had access to. The community pool renovation, which had gone significantly over budget, had been contracted to her cousin's construction company without competitive bidding. The evidence was mounting, and Karen's position was becoming increasingly untenable. The final blow came from an unexpected source: Tyler Vaughn, Karen's 22-year-old son, who was home from law school. During an emergency HOA meeting, Karen had called to try to regain control of the situation. Tyler stood up and addressed the community, his hands trembling slightly but his voice firm. "I can't stay silent anymore," he announced, his voice shaking slightly. "I've watched my mother manipulate this community for years. I've seen her forge signatures on proxies, hold secret meetings, and target families she deemed undesirable. usually for nothing more than their ethnicity or background. The room fell silent as he continued. She once told me the HOA was her personal fiefdom, and that the rules were just tools to maintain property values and keep out the riffraff. Karen tried to interrupt him, but Tyler continued. I'm studying law to help people not to abuse power like this. His face was a mask of determination. I'm sorry it took me so long to speak up. Tyler, stop this immediately, Karen hissed. You don't know what you're talking about. But Tyler stood his ground, producing emails and text messages from his mother that corroborated his claims. I kept these because I knew someday I'd need to do the right thing, he explained. I just wish I'd found the courage sooner. The meeting erupted into chaos, with board members calling for Karen's immediate resignation and homeowners demanding a full investigation into all HOA finances. After that meeting, Karen's position became untenable. With the closing date approaching and her legal options exhausted, I decided it was time to present her with a choice. I wanted resolution, not endless conflict. I invited her to meet me at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown, with both our attorneys present. She arrived looking haggard, the stress of the past weeks evident in her appearance. Gone was the perfectly coiffed HOA president with the designer wardrobe. In her place was a woman whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. So, I began once we were seated. I'm going to offer you two options. Option 1. You can buy back your house from me at a 20% premium over what I paid and sign a legally binding agreement never to return to Willow Creek Estates or serve on any HOA board within the county. Option 2. You can rent your house back from me at double the market rate, subject to a detailed list of tenant regulations I've drafted, including restrictions on paint colors, garden ornaments, and garbage can placement, that I'll be enforcing vigorously. I slid a thick document across the table, the rental agreement option. Each page was filled with increasingly absurd restrictions. Garbage cans could only be placed at the curb between 6:07 and 6:13 a.m. on collection days. Exterior lights must be exactly 42 watts, no more, no less. Holiday decorations limited to one wreath no larger than 8 inches in diameter. Lawn must be cut to exactly 1.5 inches, measured weekly by the landlord. It was a masterpiece of petty tyranny, mirroring the very rules Karen had weaponized against others. Karen glared at me with undisguised hatred. This is extortion, she hissed. My attorneys calmly interjected, no, it's a settlement offer. And given the potential civil and possibly criminal liability Miss Bond faces if the financial irregularities in the HOA books were to be formally investigated, I'd advise my client to consider it carefully. Karen's attorney whispered urgently in her ear. After a moment, Karen's shoulders slumped. Fine. I'll buy back the house, she muttered. But this isn't over. I slid the agreement across the table. It is over, Karen. This document includes a non-disparagement clause and a prohibition on litigation related to these matters. Once you sign it, we'll never have to deal with each other again. Karen signed with trembling hands, her face a mask of barely contained fury. As I watched her sign, I realized what I had accomplished wasn't just personal revenge. I had shifted the balance of power in the entire neighborhood. And I still had one last surprise that would ensure no one like Karen could abuse power in Willow Creek Estates again. In the weeks that followed, I led a complete reformation of the HOA structure and regulations with Professor Eleanor Hughes, a 60-year-old property law professor who lived in the neighborhood but had always kept her distance from the HOA. We drafted new bylaws with clear, unambiguous language. We implemented a recall mechanism that allowed 30% of residents to trigger an immediate vote of no confidence in any board member. We created a transparent financial system with regular audits by an independent firm. We required recordings of all meetings and professional parliamentary procedure. Most importantly, we crafted rules that prioritized community well-being over arbitrary aesthetic standards. The community embraced these changes enthusiastically. People who had never attended an HOA meeting before showed up to contribute ideas. We formed committees focused on different aspects of community life, activities for children, improvements to common areas, welcoming new residents, and supporting elderly neighbors. The atmosphere in Willow Creek Estates transformed from one of fear and rigid conformity to genuine community spirit. Emma blossomed in this new environment, making friends with neighborhood kids who were now allowed to play basketball in driveways and ride bikes on sidewalks without fear of violation notices. Claire Bennett stepped up to run for HOA president on a platform of transparency and inclusivity. She won in a landslide. One of her first official acts was to approve the Rodriguez family's application to purchase a home in Willow Creek, the same family Karen had previously rejected through manipulative use of the Architectural Review Committee. The day the Rodriguez family moved in, neighbors organized a welcome party, complete with children playing freely in the street and adults chatting on front lawns that weren't all identical. Walter Parker and other older residents who had been intimidated into silence under Karen's reign found their voices again. When the day came for Karen to move out, having completed the repurchase of her house at a premium that essentially erased my profit, there was no going-away party. No one came to help her load the moving truck. Emma and I watched from across the street as the last boxes were loaded and Karen's Mercedes pulled away, never to return. Emma took my hand. "Dad, can we finally take the boat out on the lake now?" she asked. I smiled, knowing we had finally found a home, a real community. But there was one small detail I hadn't told anyone about Karen and her old house. A year later, Willow Creek Estates had been transformed. Under Claire's leadership, the HOA had become a tool for building community rather than enforcing conformity. We held regular neighborhood events, established a scholarship fund for underprivileged children in the wider area, and created a mentoring program that paired retirees with local kids for fishing, gardening, and other activities. Emma had blossomed, making friends and slowly healing from the loss of her mother. The basketball hoop was back up, and neighborhood kids gathered at our house regularly. The rigid, sterile atmosphere that had pervaded Willow Creek under Karen's reign had been replaced by a vibrant, diverse community where people actually knew and cared about their neighbors. For the anniversary of the boat incident, as it had come to be known, I organized a community celebration at the lake. We set up tables along the shore with food, games, and music. Nearly every family in Willow Creek attended, a far cry from the sparsely attended formal HOA meetings of the past. During my speech, I unveiled my final surprise. I had purchased a small piece of land adjacent to the lake and developed it into a community boat dock, complete with a sign reading Willow Creek Dock, where all boats are welcome. The crowd cheered as I explained that the dock would be open to all residents, with no waiting lists or restrictive rules. Children would have priority on weekends, and we'd be starting a fishing club for interested youngsters. But that wasn't all. I revealed that I had also purchased the house Karen had moved to in her new neighborhood, not to harass her personally, but to convert it into a weekend retreat center for orphan children and struggling families who would never otherwise have the opportunity to experience lakeside vacations. When Elizabeth was sick, I explained, my voice catching slightly, we talked about what really matters in life. It's not property values or perfect lawns. It's community. It's giving kids chances they might not otherwise have. It's remembering that we're all just passing through, and what matters is how we treat each other along the way. I had elevated my actions from personal revenge to social purpose. The Karen Vaughn Memorial Children's Retreat, named with just a touch of irony, would host its first group the following month. That evening, Emma and I took the boat out onto the lake as the sun was setting. We baited our hooks and cast our lines, just as Elizabeth had once taught me to do. After a peaceful hour, Emma's rod suddenly bent. With my guidance, she reeled in her first fish, a respectable bass that we photographed and released. As we watched it swim away, Emma whispered, "Mom would be really proud of you, Dad." I pulled her close, thinking of how far we'd come from those dark days after Elizabeth's death, and how our battle with Karen had ironically helped us heal and find a true home. Sometimes rules aren't created to protect communities, but to serve those who write them. But when you're smart enough to play their game and rewrite the rules when necessary, you don't just reclaim power for yourself. You can change the entire system. And if someone tells you your boat isn't welcome, remember that sometimes the best way to move your boat is to buy the whole dock.